I'm over the moon to welcome Ed Gillett to the stage. So can you please give him a big, warm sound effects? Thank you. Oh yeah, just to let you know how the night's going to run for the new people. Me and Ed are going to talk for a bit. We're going to ask you some questions about the book, and then we're going to have an interval, a short interval where you can get a drink and go to the bathroom, and then we're going to have another talk with Vinka involved, and then another interval, and then there's loads of questions from you guys. Okay, so if you think of any, write them down or Okay. So Ed, thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to follow DJ Detweiler. I'll do my best.
I just feel a bit bad actually putting this. Okay, so your book, like, I know a bit about your work, but this just feels like a kind of, it feels like something you've been building to perhaps, especially with some of your documentary work as well. Can you tell me how it came about to write a book where it's a massive story to tell, the story of dance music in the UK, about rave culture. How did you come to write this book?
Oh, wow. Okay, so this is going to be my sort of potted life story, but it begins right here in Brighton. I grew up in Lewes. Well, I spent my teenage years in Lewes, and my first kind of revelatory experiences of dance music were sneaking out to go and see Mr. Scruff at the Concorde in the late 90s, early 2000s, and since then I've been in love with dance music. It's what's inspired and driven me in lots of ways. Weirdly, when I left university, I didn't kind of pursue that path. I had a bit of a sliding doors moment in my life. I was interning for a label also in Brighton called True Thoughts, and I'd been helping out for free and working the door at their regular club night, and the owner said to me, "Do you want a job? You can run our Saturday night, that can be your thing." And I was like, I kind of have to go back and get my degree. And music kind of passed me by for many years, so I ended up working in the charity sector for a while, working mainly for human rights organisations. So I had that kind of proximity to political issues, kind of social issues, which was the other thing that's always kind of inspired me. Gradually, I kind of fell back in love with music and started writing about it, just kind of pitching freelance articles, and quickly kind of identified a niche for myself, combining those two kind of areas of interest. So I would say that my journalism over the I started writing properly in kind of 2015. My niche, such as it is kind of the intersection of underground music, primarily but not exclusively dance music, politics from the national to the local, and kind of conflicts over physical, primarily urban space. So I've written about things like venue closures. There was a spate of venue closures in 2015. There was a study released that year that showed the UK had lost, I think, a third of its late night venues in the preceding decade. So I wrote an investigative article digging into why that was, the stories of some of the venues that had closed, and what the prognosis was for underground music. I've written about, so I live next to Brockwell Park in Brixton. Field Day got moved there because a massive American promoter came in and outbid them for the contract to run day festivals in Victoria Park in Hackney. I walk my dog in the park, so in addition to being kind of tapped into the Underground Music Network, I was also tapped into the local South London NIMBY networks, who were completely outraged at tens of thousands of young drug takers descending on their quiet little green space. So I ended up writing an article for The Guardian about kind of the conflicts between kind of local community groups, the local council and local promoters, and this kind of contest over public space, and how that tied into councils' budgets being decimated by austerity. Anyway, so I've been writing freelance about music and politics for a couple of years. In 2018, I gave up working in the charity sector and tried to kind of make a life of it as a freelance writer, which I very quickly realised was completely financially unsustainable. But I was lucky enough to get a job on a documentary, which was a social history of the UK from 1984 to 1992, told through the lens of rave music. And it was directed by an artist called Jeremy Deller, who won the Turner Prize in the early 2000s. He is famous for sort of analysing dance music as a form of folk history. So he staged a reconstruction in the same way that you get kind of reconstructions of battles from the Civil War. He staged a theatrical reconstruction of the Battle of Orgreave. So policemen and miners and filmed it, and that was kind of an artwork. He did a project with a Northern Colliery brass band where he scored old acid house records to be played by the brass band, so kind of combining two generations of industrial northern culture together. So yeah, he's always been really interested in rave music. He was working on this film. I got brought in to do essentially the research, to dig through the archives, to find lots of old archive footage of people at raves or clashing with the police, or in one instance, a bunch of people in Detroit dancing to Numbers by Kraftwerk. It's a brilliant clip. You should find it on YouTube. It's one of the best things in the world. So anyway, and in doing that, I realised that a lot of the things that I was interested in the present day around kind of power, money, dance music, space, were embedded all the way through dance music history. I'd read books like Energy Flash by Simon Reynolds and Altered State by Matthew Collin, but I hadn't really kind of dug deep into that history, and it was quite revelatory for me to realise that the stuff that I was interested in the present day was not just a function of kind of post-austerity Britain, it was actually a feature of British social history stretching back 40 years or more. And then, so those were kind of the two building blocks, and then the spark for writing the book. I wrote a piece in May of 2020, so early on in lockdown, about, I'd heard about these guys who were making a name for themselves as DJs, getting a bit of press in the dance music media, at the same time as seeing stories about them on kind of the political side of things. Well, one of their four members that cast them in a very, very different light. So they're called Housekeeping, which in itself is a slightly iffy name. And there are four members. Two of them are full-time commercial property developers. One of them is a professional aristocrat whose sister dated Prince Harry for a while, and is a regular on the society pages and in Tatler. And the fourth, by far the most relatable and down-to-earth of the four, was merely a director at Citibank for 14 years before founding his own hedge fund. And their kind of DJ, enterprise and record label, if you dig into it in Companies House, is entirely bankrolled by this one guy's kind of property development arm. He built a luxury apartment block in East London and then installed separate pour doors for the council tenants so that people paying the big bucks didn't have to cross paths with the riffraff. He bought up all of Brixton Market near where I live and started turfing out family businesses. So it was really interesting to me. Oh, and also he bought up a club that abutted the market. Obviously it was locked down, so it was closed, but as soon as he bought it, he turfed out the previous managers, and it was completely unclear what the future of the club was going to be. So it was really interesting to me that you had, on the one hand, this culture that's been steeped in kind of countercultural energy and radical politics, that these guys were kind of building a lucrative and successful kind of hobby in, at the same time that their day jobs operated in seemingly complete opposition to that. So anyway, I wrote a review of their new record, which was really kind of a moral reckoning of them as people, and that got a lot of pickup. It wasn't quite cat person levels of kind of online viral lockdown era content, but it did pretty well, and I got an email from a literary agent saying, "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" And I hadn't really thought about it prior to that. But as soon as the idea kind of was presented to me, it was like, oh yeah, of course. There's totally a history here with the things that I've written about in the present. The sort of the way that wealth, class, and power is distorting dance music now that it's heavily commercialised and professionalised, and then where that history comes from stretches all the way back to the sort of stuff that we were talking about in the film with Jeremy, and sort of even earlier than that. So yeah, that's my life in 5-10 minutes.
Congratulations for the book deal, man. It's a great book. Congrats.
Thank
you. You've chosen, like, there's been a lot of histories of this culture and this scene written at different times, and yours seems to, I don't know if it's, well, my question is, it seems to challenge accepted narratives of how we got here, you know, how we got to whatever era we're in now, which is kind of the big business techno, as you put it, these big super clubs, and you challenge a lot of the narratives and kind of, for want of a better phrase, myth bust a little bit, or like things get exaggerated or they get changed over time. And yours is like, did you set out to go like, I'm going to set the record straight, or was it like, did it emerge from the research that you were doing that like, hold on, this isn't the full picture?
I think it's a bit of both. I think some of it was deliberate, some of it was emergent. I mean, one of the big things for me is I was too young to be there during rave's golden age, right? I was born in 1983, so for me that kind of passed me by a little bit. And I mean, obviously there's lots of incredible journalism about dance music in the present now, but in terms of book-length histories, the two big ones really are Altered State and Energy Flash, both of which were written by people who were there at the time, written at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, and I felt like they didn't entirely reflect my experience as someone who grew up a little bit later, who's had 20 years of being in love with dance music, but whose life experience kind of falls slightly outside this kind of accepted history, or this idea of dance music having had this golden age between about 1987 and 1994. Part of it, I guess, kind of stemmed from the film that I worked on, Everybody in the Place. And when we started it, one of the things that Jeremy Deller was very, very clear on was that he didn't want any talking heads from DJs in their 60s talking about how good pills were in the late 80s. And that summed up for me kind of a certain type of storytelling around certainly acid house and UK dance music as a whole that treats it as something that happened at a particular point in time to a particular group of people. Those narratives are often aimed at or centred around people of a certain age who are able to experience it firsthand. They're often centred geographically around London and the South East rather than the rest of the UK. They're often disproportionately white, disproportionately male, disproportionately straight. And I wanted to write a history that covers the whole span of dance music, obviously with a really strong emphasis on the political aspect rather than necessarily lots of kind of nerdy crate digging around individual records and labels and sonic attributes. But I wanted to create a whole history that kind of took that into account and broadened the frame a little bit more. Spoke to like the experiences of my generation and younger people, put those kind of so-called golden years into slightly more historical context, both in terms of what came after them and what came before, and maybe kind of not even necessarily myth bust, because I do think that the narratives that have kind of become central in dance music are still true, they're still correct. I didn't want to necessarily negate them, but I wanted to build on them and kind of expand them, I guess.
Yeah, and within that, there are characters and events and locations and communities that I hadn't come across or hadn't seen them necessarily in the context of the story of dance music. And that I really enjoyed because I was geeking out about all those. I was like, I need to do some more research about this person. And so like some that came to mind when I was thinking of questions to ask is Pearl Alcock, who I hadn't come across before, and I guess she represents someone and a community who've been overlooked in the wider journey of dance music. Can you tell us a bit about her as an example of the people that you focus on?
Yeah, sure. So she kind of is a meeting point for loads and loads of different underground cultures. So Pearl was born in French Canada, moved to Jamaica, emigrated from Jamaica, leaving her husband behind to Leeds initially, and then to Brixton. And she set up in the basement underneath her clothes shop on Railton Road a late night unlicensed bar or shebeen. She was a proud black bisexual woman, so she ran a queer shebeen on Railton Road in the heart of kind of radical Brixton. So the Gay Liberation Front had their office a couple doors down. There were loads of black activist squats. I think Olive Morris, Althea Jones lived kind of just around the corner. So it was at the centre of these kind of political, it's really fertile political ground. It was also kind of an epicentre for queer late night culture, black queer late night culture in a way that's often kind of overlooked. The traditional history of dance music often treats it as something that kind of emerged out of nowhere. People discovered ecstasy, they discovered this like black dance music from Chicago and Detroit, and suddenly, boom. And actually a lot of the forces that created that reaction stretch back further. So the role of sound system culture is a really, really important one in terms of setting in place the infrastructure and technologies that rave would then use. Like, rave promoters were not the first people to throw parties in warehouses. It wasn't, an invention of theirs to take over post-industrial space. They borrowed that from the rare groove scene, which were like all-night warehouse parties playing kind of jazz and soul and funk in the 80s. A lot of the people running those parties had grown up throwing reggae and dub blues parties in people's houses or in youth clubs. Hull's Shabeen was essentially kind of a blues dance. So that kind of narrative and inheritance is really important, I think, to identify and point to people who were operating in ways that dance music picked up, and for which, the predominantly white male vanguard of dance music in the late 80s are given huge amounts of credit. To a certain extent, rightly so, but there are, I think, antecedents there that it's worth kind of pulling out and showing where dance music came from in the late 80s.
It's great. Nice one. Also, it's good to see. I'm into psychedelic rock and 70s rock, and it's good to see Hawkwind in a book about rave culture and dance music. Where do they fit into it?
Hawkwind play an incredibly central role. So Glastonbury 1990 was the first time that ravers and travellers kind of combined forces. So in the early 1990s, you get the free party scene, which is kind of a coalition of the new travellers who had made up the kind of free festival circuit that Hawkwind had played at in the 70s and 80s, with kind of a younger generation of rave promoters. And they would use the same sites that had been used for free festivals, but instead of Hawkwind or Jethro Tull or whoever it would be, they'd be playing house music and rave and breakbeat. And the start for that is 1990 Glastonbury. A bunch of acid house sound systems turned up, had nowhere to go, got directed towards the Travellers' Field, which was essentially the kind of lawless zone on the edge of the festival proper. And we're like, does anyone have a sound system? And Nick Turner from Hawkwind goes, I've got a PA and a tent, why don't you set up in there? And there's a great story. There's a brilliant film which isn't out yet, but I think has its premiere at the Dock and Roll Film Festival. It's called Free Party. It's directed by Aaron Trinder. And there's a story there about DIY, the sound system, running a party there. The Happy Mondays coming down, playing their headline slot, and Bez having a really spiritual moment on the dance floor with a horse. Trotted in from one of the sort of travellers' encampments, is just wandering about and like gazing deeply into Bez's eyes, which is But that was a central moment. The guy who put together the original sort of free party sound system, I think had worked with Hawkwind on their PA, ended up running a company called Turbo Sound, which if anyone's ever seen a kind of late 80s, early 90s rave flyer, would often be kind of proudly emblazoned as like the suppliers of sound. He sold Turbo Sound and then set up another company called Function One, which now does all of the sound systems for your local like business techno mega club. So there's a direct kind of lineage of technology, of association, of connection that goes back. All of these people that you wouldn't necessarily think of as playing a critical role in dance music, particularly not if you adhere to kind of the storyline that says that dance music appears from nowhere, is its own thing entirely, appears without precedent, and then kind of exists on its own. Hawkwind are the rave superstars.
For newer members of the community that are on the stairs, do you want to come up a little bit? Maybe you can stand behind there, where Jordan and Rosa, is it Rosa? A little bit. I just don't want you to stand on the stairs, it's not worth it. Hello Ali, you alright mate? Cool. Maybe, there's a good fridge back there that I've sat on before. Best seat in the house. Wicked. Alright, cheers. There's another thing, not only does it stretch back further, your book, I'm really impressed and was kind of taken on the journey past the Criminal Justice Act and past the millennium and right up to the modern day. But what I thought was so interesting, and I'd like you to elaborate if that's okay, is how grime and UK hip hop kind of are a continuation of the story of dance music. This is not something that I was expecting to read about, but you go into it a lot. So
I mean, certainly for me, like the thread that kind of connects the whole narrative is cheers.
It's nice, isn't it?
Yeah, cheers, mate. What's morning? The thread that connects the whole narrative is a power struggle, right? Between people wanting to occupy cultural or physical space, to make noise, to enjoy themselves, to let loose, and on the other hand, a structure that suggests that that is somehow decadent or suspicious or undesirable. And if you look at dance music in purely kind of sonic terms, in terms of kind of genres and like specific clubs, right? After the Criminal Justice Act, after kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, you have kind of the super club era. The super club era kind of dies away. Those kind of earlier canonical books, Energy Flash and Altered State, tend to kind of, they both kind of round off around there. They say, okay, dance music is kind of on the way down now. And certainly in terms of those specific genres, that they kind of fade from popular attention. They cease to be kind of at the centre of political debates around culture and community and young people. But what take their place are genres like jungle, garage, grime, and then drill. Like those power struggles, those moral panics over the corruption of young people are taken up by genres that aren't necessarily always looked at as part of the same lineage in sonic terms, but in social and cultural terms, at least for me, are an extension of that same history. So you see jungle, when it first appears in the mid-90s, being heavily associated with the arrival in the UK of crack cocaine, and crack being regularly linked in the broadsheet press to this new, faster, darker form of dance music. By the late 90s, Ronnie Size wins the Mercury Music Prize. Every single TV show or PlayStation video game has a drum and bass song on the soundtrack to give it this kind of gloss of modernity. It becomes kind of absorbed into the mainstream, just as house and techno had been before, and is replaced in the populist imagination with garage as kind of the new folk devil. You have So Solid Crew associated with kind of shootings and violence. There's a quote in the book from the then NME editor, Colin McNicholas, who makes the very salient point that more young white teenagers in Swindon were buying So Solid CDs than young black teenagers in the inner cities. So surely the music was the point, then they should have been attacking each other in equal numbers. So that music kind of takes on the role that more traditional forms of dance music had played earlier in the 90s. Garage then becomes pop music. It's replaced by grime. Dizzy and Skepta become pop stars. Grime becomes absorbed into the cultural mainstream. It's replaced by drill. It's the same cycle over and over again, and every single time it's the same fears, it's the same conflicts, it's the same restrictions being brought to bear, whether they are legislative, policing, or kind of communicative through the media. So for me, even though those genres are not necessarily always considered part of that lineage from 87 to 94, for me that it's the same story repeated over and over again in different spaces with different sounds, but still a connecting thread running all the way through. One of the people that I interviewed for the book is a guy called Alan Lodge, who was a photographer and an activist in the free festival scene in the 70s and 80s, and then also in the free party scene in the 90s. And he said that this goes right back to the start of human history. It's the hunter-gatherers versus the farmers. If you have one half of society who are fixed in place, you have an area of land that is mine, that I own, and if you want to use it, you have to seek my permission and pay me a fee, versus another half of society that view kind of common space, whether that's cultural or physical, as a common good and can move through and use it for enjoyment, for leisure, at their will. There's inevitably going to be a conflict when those two people want to use the same space for completely different things. So I think it's very, very fundamental to who we are as humans and how we operate as a society, regardless of what the music itself sounds like.
Speaking of space and how to use it, we are in a place that we're in Brighton, and the documentary that I made, which is about the Big Beach Boutique, which I'm sure some people were here. Was anyone at the Fatboy Slim gig on the beach? Yeah, a few people. Oh wow, great. That's a big part of your book. Well, there's a big section dedicated to Fatboy Slim and this huge party on the beach that he had. That they were expecting, X amount of people, 50,000 people were predicting, and then 250,000 people turned up. For better or for worse. Some people had the best time, some people had the worst time. Someone lost their life. So it's that's why I thought it was an interesting documentary to make, because it was a cultural event that had all these different threads running to it and from it. And But in the wider, longer journey of dance music, it's interesting. And reading your book after I'd made my film, it made me think of the event in different ways, in a different way. So can you tell me why you chose to kind of stop at that and have that as a bit of a checkpoint? Because you talk about it in the context of the creative industries, of fucking D-Ream being on the New Labour advert, you know, like all these things that like, this is what was going on. Dance music was here and now it's here.
Yeah, so that the chapter in question really looks at kind of dance music under New Labour. It's called Tony and Gordon Go Large. I did have to watch Kevin and Perry Go Large for research purposes, and I really wouldn't recommend it. I remember it being bad. It's so much worse. But yeah, so the Big Beach Boutique was really fascinating for me as an example of how dance music kind of shifted in the popular imagination between the passing of the Criminal Justice Act in 1994 and the election of New Labour in 1997 and kind of the super club era of the late 90s. And I compare it specifically to the Castle Morton Free Festival, which happened a decade earlier in 1992 on Castle Morton Common in West Mercia. It was the rearranged and relocated version of the Avon and Somerset Free Festival. It was at the height of the free party scene. The police and politicians were acutely conscious of tens of thousands of ravers amassing illegally to throw these huge unlicensed parties, and essentially kind of shepherded them away from the West Country. They ended up in Castle Morton, ended up kind of combining with a bunch of other convoys and throwing this huge multi-day free festival that ended up producing miles of outraged newspaper coverage. It was the lead item on the 6 o'clock news on BBC One. It spawned questions in Parliament, and it was not the sole reason, but a particular catalyst for the passing of the Criminal Justice Act in 1994. And Castle Morton attracted 30,000 odd people. And then a decade later, you have what is in many ways a very similar event, in that it is a free event to which anyone can come, playing loud, amplified dance music into the night. The Big Beach Boutique attracted 250,000 people, which is the entire population of Brighton double. So there are 250,000 people in Brighton, so it's like someone doubled everyone in Brighton for a day. It was complete chaos, as anyone who was there at the time will remember. People were stuck in their homes for ages. 2 people, in fact, died, neither of them directly attributable to the event. One person had a heart attack during Fatboy Slim's set, and another person fell off Marine Drive at 2 a.m. People were being ferried to Brighton Marina in lifeboats because they'd broken their legs and they couldn't be got off the beach. I read a police report so there was a period where the event stewards had been pushed back into the sea by the sheer weight of numbers, so they had been cleared off their posts, and then suddenly there was a push back up the beach, and there was very nearly a very, very scary crush on the near the steps up to the promenade. I read a police report that said we very narrowly avoided a really serious incident, but we all knew how close it was. I spoke to someone who was involved in the event organisation, who was, after the event, offered counselling as part of a programme offered to the police for basically post-traumatic stress. There were, I'm sure you remember the Argus headlines and the pictures of kind of litter strewn all over the beach, and yet, there was no sustained kind of campaign about that event. There was no, as I say in the book, there were no speeches in Parliament calling for events featuring extremely big beats to be made illegal. It was the disorder and the disruption was essentially understood as the cost of throwing a massive fun party. And the distinguishing factor between those 2 events is that one of them was licensed and sanctioned, and one of them was not. One of them was part of the traditional economy. It was operated by commercial operators. It was powered by bars that pay VAT and tax. It was seen by the council in particular as an opportunity to kind of raise Brighton's profile. It was essentially a form of kind of placemaking or tourism marketing. And through those lenses, you kind of see something very different occurring. The Big Beach Boutique caused vastly more damage and disruption than Castle Morton did, and yet attracted a fraction of the criticism, of the attempt to restrict the culture that it came from. And that, to me, really kind of emblemised the shift that dance music underwent in that decade from this barely controllable sort of mass of malevolence that threatened to kind of tear British society apart at its seams and absolutely had to be legislated against and policed aggressively, versus this kind of regrettably noisy entertainment experience. Yeah. So that's kind of the contrast that I set up in the book, and I think the Big Beach Boutique for me emblemizes that kind of contradiction.
Yes, it's interesting. It's the time. The big thing is time. You know, dance music's on, like I said, on adverts for political campaigns. Like that's unthinkable. Like even 5 years before. So lastly, and then we're going to take an interval, because there's so much we could talk about with Ed's book, and you'll all get a chance for questions in a short while. But what was your favourite of all the nuggets of all the kind of rabbit holes you went down, and the things that you found out while you were researching the book? Is there one thing that stands out as your favourite, where you're like, oh shit, like wow, like it's all been worth it for this, you know, whatever you found?
Yeah. So one of them is behind you. So that image. So I was looking through the National Archives. The National Archives, weirdly, have 2 archive files just titled Ecstasy. One of them has been made available digitally, and the other one hasn't. So I went to the National Archives in Kew to look through the other one in the hope of finding something that other people hadn't spotted. And I was leafing through it, and there were loads of kind of scientific studies on ecstasy and Home Office reports on kind of drug seizures. And then there was a report from the Pay Party Unit, which, for people who don't know, was a police unit set up in Gravesend in Kent in 1989 to deal with the rise in acid house pay parties, as they were called at the time. It was run by a guy called Ken Tappenden, who was a very fearsome bloke, had cut his teeth during the miners' strike, stopping miners getting to Nottinghamshire to support their comrades on the pickets. He was also responsible for repatriating all the bodies of British people that died in the Zeebrugge disaster, and I think he was the lead investigator on something like 30 murder cases. So yeah, not a guy to be fucked with. And he was put in charge of like clamping down on early acid house parties. And his unit had produced a report for the Home Office, which had on its cover page all of the different police forces that had collaborated with the unit in Gravesend to produce this report about the state of acid house parties across the UK. And then right in the centre, there was that, which even for the very literal tendencies of the police feels a little bit on the nose. Weirdly, I was doing a speaking event a couple of weeks ago at this kind of research library in London, and they brought out a couple of old copies of The Face that had Sinead O'Connor on the cover, and at the bottom of one of them it was something like The Police Against Ravers. So there was obviously, and it was from 1990, and I was leafing through it, and 2 things really stood out at me. The first was that The Face had got a comment for the article from Liberty's then legal officer, a young lawyer by the name of Keir Starmer, which was very interesting. So he was quoted talking about how the police attempting to shut down raves was an infringement of civil liberties and individual rights, which was, yeah, very interesting to see how far the apple falls from the tree on that one. And then the other thing that I noticed was right at the end of the article, they mentioned rumours that the Pay Party unit had on the door to their office a police roundel with a smiley face crossed out, blown up on like A3 paper with the words "Don't worry, be happy" written underneath. So which corroborates the fact that was in the archives. So yeah, so that was one of my favourite wormholes. I've got probably at least a dozen others that I could bore you with.
What's interesting about this is that as far as you could tell, as far as I could tell, no one had scanned this in. This wasn't. You couldn't find. It was hard to find online. It wasn't. No one had scanned it into it. It wasn't on the internet.
I sent it to Matthew Collin, who wrote Altered State, and he said that he had seen it before, but I don't think it's been made publicly available before.
Yeah.
So that was one of the exciting ones.
And a nice heartwarming bit of synchronicity is that's on the flyer. I put that on the flyer of sound effects as an image of rave culture and the crackdown. Before I knew it, I made that flyer in January, and he found that, dug it out of the archive. I found it on the internet from his tweet.
Yeah, I tweeted it.
It must have been on your Twitter. And then I put it on the thing, and now look, he's here. How good is that? Can you put your hands together for Ed Gillett, please? We're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we'll come back with Peter Peterson, and you can all ask some questions as well later on. Cheers.